Today, we're going to talk about 4 key shifts that we see reshaping the apparel industry. Now, I know it's a little bit difficult to be thinking about anything other than a lot of the current chaos that's hit the industry. It seems like every year for the past almost 5 years, it's been something else. Difficult to be thinking long term when you can barely survive the short term, if you know what I mean. But still, it's important to take a look at some of the long-term trends and figure out how we can align with them. So if you're ready, let's dive in. So let's take a look at some of the things that we see happening, 4 that we've identified. Again, in order to keep this presentation within a time constraint, we'll stick to just 4. And the first one is prioritizing profitability, which is sort of a new way of looking at the industry because it certainly hasn't been like that for a long time. The second we're looking at is how technology is now a must, not a maybe. The fact that quality is becoming not just a cost, but an opportunity. So we'll dive into that a bit. And then we'll take a look at some new channels and some new markets that may or may not offer opportunities for some of the brands and suppliers. So let's first take a look at prioritizing profits. Wow. For at least 2 decades, the mantra seemed to be just grow the top line and we can fix the bottom line later. It was just sales growth and scale and get as big as you can. And certainly, if you were trying to get an IPO, that's the direction people wanted to go in. And if you're a publicly listed company, you always have to be showing growth. But at a certain point, you have to also take care of the bottom line. And there's been concern for, like I said, for decades about how long can we continue on this path of really having razor thin margins, of continually selling things at a cheaper and cheaper price. Where is this going to hit the wall? And in recent years, we have seen it hit the wall. We've seen big brands that were some of the pillars of the apparel and footwear community, be toppled. So the question is, what do we do? Where are we going to go next? And how are we going to somehow, shore up the industry so that we're on a better footing? Now, if you look at brands recently, you have seen a lot of senior executives pointing to exactly this, because it's like year after year of, growing sales but losing money, and then eventually not even being able to have the funding, the resources to be able to grow sales. So it just becomes a downward spiral. And I think, in a recent earnings call, the CEO of Allbirds said that they need to shift to be able to focus on full price selling, to be able to support the long-term health of the brand. And I think that's really very critical, because ultimately you erode your brand. So for example, if you look at Nike, Nike was just an unbelievable fortress brand. Nobody could beat Nike. Last 2 years, that really has not been the case. We really saw Nike take a very big tumble and struggle to be able to get back on its feet. And of course, there were many, many different factors. We did a quite involved story about that in Inside Fashion. However, one of the key things is that Nike leaned in too heavily into promotions, into discounting. And their new CEO, Elliott Hill, has pointed to the fact that they need to be able to get away from this constant churning product through the market on markdowns. And, as he points out quite rightly so, part of being a premium brand is being able to sell the product at full price. Not that you don't have some things on clearance, but when 50% of your inventory is on markdown or clearance or promotion, it's not good. Your brand loses value. And for most companies that have brands, that brand value is their biggest asset. So when you're allowing that to erode, you're basically allowing your biggest asset to be devalued. So that isn't where you want to go as a brand. You can see here Victoria's Secret back in bankruptcy for the second time. I mean, they used to be a powerhouse on the intimate apparel scene. What happened? And here, CEO Hillary Super says, well, we need to be able to get out of that, that environment of promotions. We need to find opportunities to be able to sell on brand, not on promotion. So you can see whether you're talking about active sports, whether you're talking about intimates, or anything in between, the message is there that CEOs are starting to realize this is not the way forward. We need to be able to get back to be able to support full price. And full price, of course, supports margins. It's not just selling on full price for the sake of it. In their recent earnings, Doc Martens, CEO, said the same thing, right? So that's more of a niche brand. So you can see that it's not just one company or one category. You can see that across multiple categories, everyone's coming to the same conclusion. We need to return to full price selling. And I think it's interesting because what we're seeing, and for years we've been seeing this, the movement at the consumer level of buying fewer but better. So consumers are starting and continuing to look for products that are better quality. They'd rather buy fewer things but better. Now, a lot of people are going to say, Jane, that isn't the case. Look at the success of Shein and other, very budget-priced brands. But the point is, everyone doesn't buy Shein, and if they do, they're not buying everything from Shein, right? So they might buy some things, right, more trendy things at a very inexpensive price, but they're also looking for other pieces that they'll spend more for if they can find something that they feel is good. So they might invest in a better pair of jeans or a better coat or something like that, right, if they can find it, if they find something that they think is more appealing. And at the same time, we have to consider the fact that a lot of the people who are leaning into the very budget fashion are very young. And when you're young, you don't care as much about quality. But that said, those very consumers who don't care about quality now because they're young will grow up and they'll start to care. So we can't assume that because, your 13 or 14-year-old doesn't really care and just wants to buy a lot of cheap stuff, that they're going to have that same point of view when they are 18, right? Or when they're 20. And that day will come, quite quickly. So we have to, look beyond, what's right in front of us and be able to see a bigger picture. So I think that, we're starting to see this recognition. And I think if we look at what brands are actually doing, I think Marks & Spencer is a very interesting case study because their apparel business really fell off the wagon. And they were struggling to get back on track. And then they came back and they have sort of, you might say, reimagined or reinvented themselves, but not just getting back in terms of getting their sales going. They're able to sell at full price. They really focused on saying, we just can't be, the discount guys. So they focused on being able to sell at full price. And you can see here on this slide that they're able to sell nearly 80% of their merchandise within the fashion category. I think it's fashion and home at 80% of it at full price, which is just remarkable in our industry, right? Very enviable. But the point is, if they can do it, others can do it. And if we look here, for example, at Next, for years they've been talking about how they're able to sell at full price. They're focusing on selling at full price. They're trying to move away from being promotion driven, and it's worked for them. You can see here, for example, in their recent earnings that revenue was up by 55 million pounds or $71 million above what they had initially expected. And a lot of that is because they were able to sell at full price. So I think that's, it shows it can be done. A lot of people, when you put forward these ideas, they say, oh, this is just a nice idea. Yes, of course, it looks good on paper, but it's not going to work at retail. But when you see brands that are actually doing it, it's proof that it obviously can be done. So I think that this is sending a very important message to our industry. It's the kind of thing that you'll see a few people doing it, and a lot of other people will say, well, they're different, well, this or that. But as more people start to lean into this, it'll be more difficult for everybody else to ignore it. So I think we are going to be seeing that shift from brands to focus more on how can we drive full price sales rather than just volume at a very cheap price with no margins, which is, of course, less sustainable, you might say, in every sense of that word for the brand, but also, is a tremendous burden on the supplier, right? Because it's that constant pressure for, lower prices, make it cheaper. I think the focus will shift towards how do we move up as opposed to how do we continue to go further down. So I think that's a very interesting development. When you look at it, and touching upon quality and taking, this sort of leads into that, right? Because to be able to sell at full price, you need to have better quality. Now, a lot of times people will say, "Oh, Jane, you can make better quality, but it costs a lot more, and who's going to pay for that?" Well, quality, right, might now just become an opportunity, not a cost. And not just because consumers are wanting something better. It's because we are under pressure to be more sustainable. And to be more sustainable, part of that is creating products that are more durable, products that are made from better quality materials, right, that are allegedly less toxic, that have been made in factories that are greener, and again leaning into a more sustainable way of doing things. And that really dovetails with quality. So I think that the added, you may say, expense of moving towards higher quality will not only please the consumer, but will also be able to support the goals that people have to be more sustainable. And as you know, durability is becoming a critical factor. I know in the EU, brands now have to meet certain criteria for showing that the product is durable. They want to get away from all these things that are cheap, one-time use or whatever. So this is something that will be a cost, but it will also be something that can be parlayed into an opportunity. Consumers are increasingly quality conscious. Even at fast fashion price points, they want something better, not realizing that it may cost a bit more to make it better. But at the same time, we are seeing consumers seeing two products side by side, and one is a bit more expensive, not vastly more expensive, but a little more expensive, but the quality is better, and they will go for it. In other words, they're not going to just sit there and say, whatever's the cheapest, that's what I'm doing. It's, this is a little more expensive, but I sort of like the way it fits. Fabric feels better. So we have to be able to, think from the point of view of the consumer. Everything is not just being purchased as something cheap. Sometimes, yes, if you want something trendy, maybe you'll just go for the cheap version of it because you figure I'm probably not going to be able to wear it for that many seasons. But I think that we're overlooking those opportunities for products that could be made better and that consumers would appreciate if it was better. This, I think, was really interesting, and I wanted to share it with you. This is a study from Bain, and they talk about how quality leads to greater sustainability. Excuse me. And I thought this was interesting because they had done their own study on this, and they came to the conclusion that you can position quality as a gateway to sustainability. So I think they articulated that better than I did a few slides ago. And they talk about the fact that, people see durability, right, as as long-term value. So it's part of that overall value proposition. And in the study that they had done, the survey they had done, quality was the number one factor that consumers were looking for, even above price and style. And durability as a touch point was the ranked fourth, right, on the consumer preference list, and directly linked to sustainability. So I think there's so many different indications of how this is important and why we want to be able to consider the advantages of quality, not just just make it better for the sake of better. What are the other sort of overlooked or hidden advantages? Now let's talk about something entirely different, technology. Wow, our industry has been really resistant to tech, you might say. You mentioned technology, they're like, this isn't Silicon Valley around here, Jane. So, that's not us. Well, Nowadays, I think that more companies, whether they're brands or suppliers, are realizing that you can't survive anymore without some kind of technology, and probably a lot of technology. You need to be able to automate things. You need to be able to speed things up. You need to be able to handle a hell of a lot more data. So it's not viable anymore to try to exist just on manual labor. That's put everybody sort of in a predicament because they have to figure out what technology they need, how to implement it, and as you know, technology is developing very fast. So still, we're seeing companies now leaning into this a lot more. And good news for everybody who is leaning into getting systems into their company. Luckily, it's a lot easier to do nowadays on account of the fact that technology has become a lot more accessible. It's more user-friendly, there's a lower learning curve. It's not like the old days where you needed a massive CapEx budget and then you needed to have an awful lot of time to train everybody up on this very different system. And then nobody wanted to use it because it's so different from what they're used to doing. So they just go back and use the old system or do it the old way. So it was just, basically a fail. But nowadays, technology is a lot simpler. It's a lot lighter. There's a lot of systems that are more plug and play that you can layer onto legacy systems, so you don't have to, tear down your whole system. You can add components on. It's really a lot more adaptable, and it's affordable nowadays. There's a lot of different options out there. So if you can't afford one system, there's usually something else that you could, start to bring in, at least in one capacity or another. Now, that being said, that's the good news, right? That it's more affordable and accessible. However, that also means that technology is not a moat. It's not a strategic advantage anymore. It used to be it was, right? Because your competitors probably couldn't afford it. But now, even somebody who is running an apparel business out of their basement can basically afford a certain amount of software. So, and that can function really, really well, surprisingly. So now the winners are going to be the companies who can use that technology the most strategically, who can master that technology, who can figure out how to use those tools. And that's really what technology is a tool. Bring it into your business and be able to figure out how to use that to optimize whatever you're doing, whether that be running a brand or running a factory. So it's really going to be mastering technology, executing solutions more efficiently, finding new use cases. So I think that these are the kinds of, this is the way we need to be able to look at technology rather than just a Band-Aid that we're going to put on a problem. But without technology, it's going to be very difficult to manage certainly the amount of data that we need to collect nowadays, even if just for compliance reasons. Most companies have some variation on ERP and PLM. That's been around for a long time and quite solid within companies. So now it's going to be, how do we take that and use it more skillfully, right? We've seen a huge uptake in 3D printing. It's still not 100% replacing samples and things like that, but more companies are feeling confident with it. So, that's a slow process, but it's a process that's happening. And then, of course, the newer area is, how do we use AI? And AI is it includes a massive number of functions. So the thing is, everyone has to think about, well, not just slap an AI solution onto our company, but how can we bring it in a way that's going to do something that will benefit the company? So it takes a lot of thinking to be able to identify use cases, to be able to figure out how you might want to use it, and then be able to execute it. I think that right now we're mainly seeing people who are bringing it through in the design side of things. So this is some feedback from our current situation in sourcing quarterly reports that we do, where we actually sit down with brands and with suppliers and so forth, and really try to get a deeper understanding of what they're seeing, what they're doing, how they're reacting. So when we talk about AI, by and large, we're seeing more of it coming through on the design side, right? To be able to iterate on designs faster, to be able to amp up your design team. we are seeing only a little bit of it starting to, people touching upon it in terms of demand planning and forecasting and so forth. Certainly everybody looks at what Shein has been able to do, which is just remarkable. And people want to be able to bring some of that into their company, right, from the point of view of certainly better forecasting and so on. But we don't see a lot of that just yet. But I think that the pace of that will pick up pretty fast. Finally, we're going to talk about markets and channels. So typically we have our channels, right? We're selling either directly at retail, we're selling online. That's typically the way apparel is distributed. However, you have a lot of interesting niches that come through. One of them certainly is what we call swag, which are corporate gifts, concerts and events and all the merchandise around that. Sports tourism is another big one. So let's take a look here and see what we have. Events and all the merch around events is a long way away from the old days, right? Where you'd go to a concert and you'd get a T-shirt with the band's logo or something hot stamped on it. Those are the old days. Now, a lot of the merch around these celebrities or these groups or so forth is quite involved. They're, collections that have been developed around these celebrities. We saw a lot of that around Taylor Swift during her Eras tour and Beyonce during her Renaissance tour. It was a lot more than just go to the concert and buy a T-shirt or a hoodie. Tremendous collections that were being developed and sold online, even to people who didn't go to the event. So, when you look at the volume of the merchandise, right, when you look at the price points, not being sold on markdown and being sold at fairly respectable prices. $90 for a hoodie is not half bad, or $45 for a T-shirt. I think that we need to think about that. We don't think about it because it's a non-traditional channel, and yet it just continues to grow year on year. And a subset of that, or maybe tangent to that, is what's being called sports tourism. And we also did a story about that in Inside Fashion. We'd written about the concert merch scene, but when you look at now what's being called sports tourism, so it's not just going to a game, it's traveling to some other place to go and see an event, and then all the things you do around it. And of course, a lot of merchandise is being sold that ties in with that, right? Whether it be for a team or for the event itself or any number of things that are tie-ins. So again, price points for some of these things are very high. And again, the volume, right, of this is just tremendous. I mean, an estimated 70 to 100 billion is spent on apparel products, right, as part of sports tourism worldwide. That is not a small number. And, again, typically for retail, $25 to $50 each. Hoodies and sweatshirts from $70 to $80. There's something to be said about that. I'm not saying this is an opportunity for everybody, but it's something that's worth giving some thought to and thinking about, could I get a piece of that action? And finally, we're talking about corporate gifts, or what's oftentimes referred to as swag. So again, we had called this out in one of our previous Inside Fashion issues, and I think we'll probably do a deeper dive into it sometime in the coming few months. And that is the idea that companies want to be able to have gifts for customers, particularly if they're doing an event. It could be a dinner, it could be a retreat, it could be anything really. Even just if they come to your office and you want to give them something, right? Big client or something like that. In the old days, right, you used to get a pen with the company's name hot stamped on it, a mug maybe with the logo. If you got lucky, perhaps an umbrella, always useful. Now, companies want to do something far better. So brands are sitting there saying to themselves, some of the more forward-thinking brands are now approaching companies and saying, we could do a collection that has co-branding on it, right? And you could leverage our brand, but you'd also have your brand on it. So here in this slide, you can see there's an advertisement from Quince, which is quite a solid millennial or maybe older Gen Z brand. And they're reaching out to companies, and they're pointing out that they recently did a collab like that with CBRE, which is a prestigious property agency. And the idea is that now CBRE has these down vests that they can give to better clients, and that has their logo on it, but that also leverages the value and quality of Quince. So it's not just, oh, here's a promo item, right? That, doesn't really look like it's much of a high value gift. But now, oh, this is a vest. This is, down. Oh, wow, that's pretty nice. Oh, it has our logo on it. So another opportunity for brands. Is this an opportunity for every brand? Probably not. But it's an opportunity that maybe if you're running a brand, you want to think about. Maybe there's an opportunity there for suppliers. So it's important to be able to be aware of all these sort of little niches that are bubbling up and that are and oftentimes becoming quite sizable. Thanks so much for joining me here at Inside Fashion. If you have questions, please feel free to reach out. You can either leave a comment, send an email. There's a variety of ways you can reach me. It depends what platform you're on. I would love to hear from you. And if there's topics that you'd like me to cover, things that are of interest or that you have questions on, let me know. We're definitely open to ideas and recommendations. Again, thank you for being with me. And I'm Jane Singer, and I will see you next time.